Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's streaming-only History is Lunch. We're working safely with a skeleton crew from our home in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium here in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. I note with sadness the death of our friend Connie Curry, who told the story of the Carter family from Drew, Mississippi in civil rights and who collaborated with Aaron Henry and Winnie Hudson on their books. It's a loss for us all. She was a friend of the department and leaves behind a great legacy. I hope that you will be able to join us for History's Lunch next week when Philip Gordon will discuss his new University Press of Mississippi book, Gay Faulkner, Uncovering a Homosexual Presence in Yoknapatawpha. Today, we're delighted to welcome Mississippi State University digital archivist Jenifer Ishee to present Women's Suffrage in Mississippi. Jenifer Ishee is digital archivist and coordinator of the Digital Preservation and Access Unit at Mississippi State University. She earned her undergraduate degree at the University of Southern Mississippi, a master's degree at the University of Nebraska, and her master's in Library and Information Science from Kent State University. Ishee is currently a doctoral student in the Mississippi State University History Department. Jenifer Ishee curated the exhibit Votes for Women for MSU, and unfortunately the COVID-19 virus has changed the plans that we had to actually have that mounted at the state archives this year. I hope we'll be able to make that happen at some point in the future. She has presented on topics in women's history at state and national conferences, including the 2020 Mississippi Historical Society annual meeting, the 2019 Women and the Law Symposium in Jamestown, Virginia, the 2020 American Society of Church History annual conference in New York City, and the 2020 Southeastern American Society of 18th Century Studies in Macon, Georgia, where she was the recipient of the award for Best Graduate Student Essay. Now, here's Jenifer Ishee.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, and thank you for all of you that are watching from home. I hope you enjoy this, and thank you for participating in these weekly lunch series. I know they've been really great, and everybody's been enjoying them. Today we're going to talk about the national suffrage movement, and then we're going to narrow down our focus to Mississippi. We're going to cover a lot of ground, so just stay with me, and I hope you enjoy this. As organizations around the country prepare to celebrate the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which takes place in August of this year, historians are looking back at the struggle for women's suffrage and examining the people and events involved in the long fight to allow women to participate in the political process for the first time as true citizens. When discussing women's suffrage, a lot of attention has been given, and rightly so, to leaders such as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul. But today, we are going to explore some of the lesser-known women who participated as suffrage leaders, including those in Mississippi. And we're going to talk about some of the more unusual debates that were at the heart of the suffrage issue. Often, a review of the arguments surrounding women's suffrage focuses on the political, social, and economic considerations that factored into the national deliberation for the enfranchisement of women. You can see at the top here, it's hard to read, but basically they're saying that she can't vote because she can't fit into the ballot booth with her large dress. So that was one of the stranger arguments. However, prevalent in these arguments was a continuous stream of religious rhetoric used by those on both sides of the issue. Arguments that enlisted the authority of the divine were used in almost equal portion by those for and those against women's suffrage. In fact, religious rhetoric over the suffrage question sometimes divided families and congregations. Theological arguments cut at the very core of the controversy because they focused on whether the movement was sanctioned by God or whether it was in complete opposition for God's design for women. For many Americans, this was seen as the first radical feminist movement, and as such, represented a challenge to religious norms. For suffragists, the movement was an attempt to secure what they perceived as their God-given right as citizens of a democratic society. Sometimes, even members of pious, theologically grounded families differed in their opinions regarding the suffrage issue. In the latter part of the 19th century, the well-known pastor of the Plymouth Congregational Church in Brooklyn, Henry Ward Beecher, was not only an abolitionist but a suffragist, and preached frequently about the equality of women and his support of the suffrage movement. Beecher was eventually elected president of the American Woman Suffrage Association in 1869. He argued that, quote, woman suffrage will bring civilization into our primary meetings and decency into our secondary ones. He also argued that he himself had searched scriptures and failed to find a place in the Bible where it said that a woman shall not vote. However, Henry's sister Catherine Ward Beecher opposed women's suffrage. Although she was educated and an author, she devoted her energies towards encouraging women in their domestic spheres by writing books on domestic economy and against suffrage, believing that the vote was outside of God's design for women and their families. In her piece, The True Remedy for the Wrongs of Women and Women's Suffrage, she argued that her gender should focus on home and school, and that their role as teachers and mothers was more important than participation in politics. Their father was Lyman Beecher, a prominent Presbyterian minister and evangelist. And of course, their other sibling was Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. In the course of nearly a century, fighting for their enfranchisement, suffragists found themselves negotiating limitations with the usual suspects: church leaders, politicians, and other men who held positions of authority. However, one of the greatest causes of consternation for leaders in the movement were the negotiations they were called upon to maneuver with members of their own sex. The anti-suffrage movement, often led by women, was vocal, well-populated, and presented a real threat to the success of those seeking the right to vote. The antis, as they were called, firmly believed in their cause as much as the suffragists, and this created a dilemma for the movement. Women opposed to suffrage saw the home as a religious front against the ills of society, and believed the self-centered nature of the suffragist was in direct opposition to the selfless nature of women whose lives centered around God and family. These female anti-suffragists often used religious rhetoric to express their opinions. Helen Johnson's Woman and the Republic, published in 1913, argued that the Bible and the church was the source of a woman's true rights, and that if the church maintained its power and authority in the community, women would have a place of leadership in their homes. She spoke against women preachers like Anne Hutchinson, Lucretia Mott, and Elizabeth Stanton, stating their story was as old as time itself, and they should learn from Eve's predicament that, quote, woman first aspired. She stretched forth her hand to seize the good, and in so doing, snatched the evil that grew beside it. The 1848 Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence, and authored by leading abolitionist and suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was signed by 68 women and 32 men, including Frederick Douglass. The document addressed the inequality in the mainstream denominations, stating, he allows her in church as well as in state, but in a subordinate position, claiming apostolic authority for her exclusion from the ministry, and with some exception from any public participation in the affairs of church. Despite this proclamation, during the era of the suffrage campaigns, women outside of mainstream denominations were allowed leadership roles in the pulpit. Women preachers who spoke out on behalf of women's rights were involved in two dissident actions. They were speaking publicly about religious matters, and they were speaking publicly about political matters. At state conventions, they were referred to by their titles of reverend or pastor and asked to open the meetings with prayer. Frances Willard, Florence Randolph, Julia Ward Howe, and Olympia Brown are just a few of the women preachers who also served leadership roles in suffrage organizations. One of the earliest and most impressive of the women preachers was the African-American Sojourner Truth, who stood almost 6 feet tall and was a dominant figure when giving speeches in support of women's rights and suffrage. As an illiterate, emancipated slave, she was an unlikely advocate for women's suffrage. However, her voice was highly influential throughout the movement. Speaking at a women's rights convention in Akron in 1851, she warned, if the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down, all alone, These together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. Perhaps the greatest manifestation of religious organizations' influence on the suffrage movement was the conversion in 1880 of the Women's Christian Temperance Union to the cause. This was largely due to the efforts of their new president, Frances Willard. The WCTU was the largest women's organization in existence at the time and had previously focused their attention not only on prohibition, but also on what they believed was their God-given duty to increase morality in their society by indirectly influencing men. To do this, the WCTU leadership had to convince the large Christian evangelical membership that voting was actually part of a woman's duty as a Christian, and that in fact, they themselves felt called by God to enter this work. Frances Willard created the new motto, which was adopted by the WCTU. Woman will bless and brighten every place she enters, and she will enter every place. For Willard, this included the pulpit and the ballot booth. In order to convince the large membership, however, she and other leaders in the organization who supported suffrage had to redefine the image and meaning of a true Christian woman. In the 19th century, because the spirit of revivalism, led by Dwight Moody, had swept the eastern and midwestern cities, the idea of individual convergence to God's saving grace was a strong argument for religious behavior. It was hard for Christian opponents of suffrage to argue with a woman who claimed to have received a changed, reinterpreted image of herself through a personal conversion experience. Frances Willard had such an experience and shared it with other members of the WCTU, stating, "Upon my knees alone, there was born upon my mind, as I believe from loftier regions, the declaration, you are to speak for women's ballot as a weapon of protection to her home and tempted loved ones from the tyranny of drink." Leaders of the WCTU packed pulpits on any given Sunday across the country. At one event, over 50 women preached both Sunday morning and evening services to packed sanctuaries. Religious leaders of the same faith were sometimes divided over the suffrage issue. Two of the country's most prominent rabbis went head-to-head in a battle over women's suffrage, Rabbi Joseph Silverman of New York's Temple Emmanuel, and Rabbi Stephen Wise, leader of New York City's Free Synagogue. Silverman told his congregation on March 22, 1915, that, quote, polygamy, free love, and the disruption of the home are to follow in the wake of women's suffrage. At the opposite end of the debate, Rabbi Wise was a founding member of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage. Wise, along with Oswald Garrison Villard, publisher of the New York Evening Post, John Dewey, and other prominent businessmen, were charter members of the organization that spanned across 35 states and enlisted thousands of members. Silverman wrote and spoke out against women's suffrage, and Wise just as vehemently supported it. To complicate matters, in 1912, Silverman and Wise, together with 19 other Eastern American colleagues, had formed the Eastern Council of Reformed Rabbis, which eventually was called upon to make a joint statement on the suffrage question. With the important 1917 vote in the New York House looming, Wise began to push for a pro-suffrage resolution. By this time, both men were well known for their stance on the issue. A fierce debate took place between the two prior to the council's vote, to such an extent that Rabbi Isaac Moses labeled them scrapping roosters. Despite Silverman's objection, the resolution passed, and the Eastern Council stood in solidarity as, quote, ethical leaders and as preachers of a religion which has stood throughout the centuries for justice and righteousness, to assert our belief in the justice and righteousness of the enfranchisement of the women of our country. On November 5th, 1917, New York men voted in favor of the enfranchisement of women in their state referendum. Though attention to the history of the suffrage movement generally focuses the struggle for women's rights as beginning in the 19th century, the disparity between the legal rights of men over women was readily acknowledged by women of influence at the founding of this nation. In 1776, Abigail Adams, wife of future U.S. President John Adams, wrote to him and stated, In the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. Unfortunately, her request fell on deaf ears. The subsequent U.S. Constitution and state statutes most definitely failed to remember the ladies. It was not until the 19th century that women in America began to make gains in their status under the law. Common law defined a woman's legal status through coverture as a femme covert, meaning that when she married, everything she previously owned became the property of her husband. Under common law, women could not execute contracts with their husband's permission, and they could not sell or own property or even write a will. Coverture is defined under common law as suspending the very being or legal existence of the woman, so long as she is under the protection of her husband. In the 1830s, Sarah Grimke and her sister Angelina, both converter Quaker abolitionists, began to write pamphlets about the equality of the sexes and the evils of slavery. Also around this time, women began to petition the courts and their state legislators for expanded rights under the law. The push for women's suffrage came on the heels of another important advancement in women's rights, the passage of married women's property acts throughout the country. And surprisingly, Mississippi played a prevalent role, being the first state to pass such an act in 1839. It has been argued that the passage of these acts was the direct result of women's agitation for property as well as voting rights. In an effort to appease women's demands, lawmakers were ready to relinquish rights for property, but not the vote, which they saw as too radical. Mississippi State Representative Robert Joslin had this to say in the 1830s about passage of the Married Women's Property Act. Pass the bill, and what will be the result? Where there should be union, there will be division. Confidence will be impaired, jealousy will arise, matrimonial quarrels will occur, domestic happiness will be lost. Despite his fellow representatives' misgivings, in 1839, Mississippi State Senator Thomas B.J. Hadley introduced the first bill in the nation for the purpose of granting married women rights to their own personal property. Many scholars have questioned why Mississippi would be the first state to pass such an act. It does not seem logical that the last state in the Union to ratify the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, should, almost a decade earlier, possess seemingly enlightened ideas regarding a married woman's legal rights. Scholars often point to the 1837 Mississippi case of Fisher v. Allen, in which the Mississippi Supreme Court ruled that a slave was the property of the wife because Chickasaw tribal customs granted women the right to own separate property and to dispose of it as they saw fit. In this case, Betsy Allen, a Native American woman, had deeded a slave to her daughter, which barred Fisher, a creditor, from claiming the slave as property to satisfy her husband's debts. This was but one of many court cases occurring at the time challenging the common law practice of coverture throughout the country, which led to the need for a new law or statute defining married women's property rights. Meanwhile, women living in sections of the country recently acquired from Spain and France, like Florida, Texas, and Louisiana, were already allowing limited property rights to married women because they had this right under Spanish law. Other historians point to the desire to find a loophole in the Contracts Clause of the Constitution in order to relieve debtors of their obligations. With the financial panic of 1836, the price of cotton fell 50%, which led to a panic in the South and so many creditors' lawsuits that some newspapers reported that citizens in the Mississippi Delta region had torn down the courthouse. All of these circumstances, the Fisher v. Allen case, the financial panic, and the freedom women enjoyed under Spanish, French, and Native American law, found their home in the person of Piety Hadley, wife of Representative Thomas Hadley, referred to earlier, who introduced the Married Women Property Act in Mississippi. Apparently, having spent some time in New Orleans, 31-year-old Piety was an admirer of Indian laws and Spanish and French laws, which granted property rights to women. And it just so happened that Piety ran a boarding house, and some of her patrons included her husband's fellow legislators. It has been suggested that Piety lobbied her husband, and perhaps her boarders, for the passage of an act granting married women the right to their property. The proposal that her husband introduced was radical, in that it sought to give women the right to make a will after they were married. The broad version of this bill did not pass. What did pass was titled An Act for the Protection and Preservation of the Rights of Married Women, and contained 5 sections. The first section stated that any married woman may possess property, real or personal, in her name as her own property. Unfortunately, the remaining 4 sections addressed the slave-owning provision of the law in an effort to shield slaves owned by the wife from debtors. It is incredibly unfortunate that the first legal acknowledgement of women's rights was tied to slavery and was a manipulation of the law couched in the premise to grant women legal rights. The leaders of the women's suffrage movement began their campaigns for social justice as abolitionists. They wanted equality under the law for its own sake. Now, 50 years later, the Mississippi Suffrage Association was formed in 1899, but it was unsuccessful in efforts to organize support until 1906, when Miss Belle Kearney, who would later become the first female senator elected to the Mississippi legislature, Mrs. Butte, Mrs. Edward Sloan, and Dr. Delia Randall met at the Edwards home in Jackson to galvanize the association and elect officers. Nellie Nugent Somerville, active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was elected president. Later, she would become vice president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. In 1907, a 5-day conference took place at the home of Charles and Lily Thompson in Jackson. The association discussed introducing a measure at the next session of the legislature and met with the governor to plead their cause. In 1908, a state convention was held at the governor's mansion in Jackson, and thereafter state conventions were held in various cities across Mississippi, including Starkville, Meridian, Gulfport, and Greenville. The prominent African-American suffragist Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862. After the war, her parents became politically active in Reconstruction politics. In 1878, a yellow fever epidemic hit her hometown, and she lost her parents and her infant brother. Wells, along with her other siblings, relocated to Memphis, where she worked as an educator and wrote and spoke extensively in the U.S. and abroad about the horrors of lynching. She also spoke out against the failure of the national women's organizations to condemn lynchings. Even though suffragists like Wells, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman actively promoted women's rights, women of color were often excluded from national and local suffrage organizations and their activities. In 1896, a group of African American women, including Ida B. Wells, founded the National Association of Colored Women, and suffragist Mary Church Terrell became their first president. Terrell attended Oberlin College, where she obtained a bachelor's and a master's degree, and her family was part of the rising black middle and upper class who used their education and positions to fight racial discrimination. Their motto was "Lifting as we climb," and Terrell participated in picketing the White House with members of the National Women's Party. Black women had a compelling reason for their involvement in the suffrage movement beyond their own desire for equality in the political sphere. They believed their power and influence over social and civil rights issues specific to their race would be increased if women were allowed to vote, especially at the national level. Now, throughout the country, suffragists created newsletters, magazines, and utilized the press to promote their cause. In 1907, Mississippi suffrage leaders attempted to further their cause by establishing the office of Superintendent of Press Work and enlisting the help of the state's press editors. Correspondence was delivered to over 200 editors to ascertain their attitudes towards women's suffrage and to request space in their newspapers for editorials and advertisements regarding upcoming suffrage events. The organization received 21 positive responses, and this began a decade-long relationship with the press, where local events and speaker series were published and weekly suffrage columns appeared. Although national news related to the movement was presented, the columns primarily included articles from local women because they felt that an ounce of Mississippi was worth a pound of Massachusetts. Among the friendly editors were L. Pink Smith of the Greenville Democrat, J.R. Oliphant of the Poplarville Free Press, C.E. Glasgow of the Cleveland Enterprise, Joseph Norwood of the Magnolia Gazette, James Falk of the Greene County Herald, and Frank R. Birdsall of the Yazoo Sentinel. Wives of press editors who were also suffragists were in a unique position to influence the movement through the press. Alma Dorsey Birdsall was born July 2, 1866, in Mechanicsburg in Yazoo County, Mississippi. After completing high school, she attended Whitworth Female College in Brookhaven, graduating with high honors. After graduation, she taught school for 9 years in Yazoo County and then went on to marry Frank Birdsall at Trinity Church in Vicksburg. They made their home in Pulaski, Tennessee, where her husband ran the Giles County Record. After 2 years in Pulaski, they returned to Yazoo City, where her husband purchased and ran the Yazoo Sentinel. Mrs. Birdsall was a prominent figure in Yazoo City and involved in the Mississippi Women's Suffrage Association, holding the post of secretary and vice president. In 1913, Mrs. Birdsall wrote an article titled "Why Women Ought to Vote," which appeared, of course, in the Yazoo Sentinel. An article appearing in the Yazoo Herald in October 1914 announced that Annie Kincaid Dent and Alva Birdsall's election to president and vice president of the Women's Suffrage Association. The article further declared that a better selection could not have been made, as they are wonderfully gifted with brains and an amount of executive ability that falls to the lot of but a few. Mississippi suffragists were involved in numerous campaigns beyond press work. In 1910, at the TriState Fair in Memphis, the Mississippi Association joined the Tennessee Association in a booth which featured a press exhibit several yards long containing pasted clippings from Mississippi newspapers as well as suffrage arguments. In 1913, there was a Women's Suffrage Day at the State Fair, with members of the association manning the suffrage booth and garnering support from visitors to the fair. Speeches were given by members, and a contest was conducted for the best argument for women's suffrage written by a college student. 6 Mississippi colleges were presented, and Pearl Powell of the Industrial Institute and College won. By 1917, there were over 3,000 members of the Mississippi Suffrage Association. Mississippi suffragists were not only involved in the local level, they frequently attended national conventions, parades, and demonstrations. On March 3, 1913, Fannie Mae Witherspoon, daughter of Congressman Witherspoon, represented Mississippi in the National Suffrage Parade in Washington. On October 31, 1914, the Brookhaven Semi-Weekly Leader detailed the upcoming Women's Suffrage Association convention to be held in Nashville. In attendance from Mississippi would be Mrs. Annie K. Dent of Yazoo City, then president of the Women's Suffrage Association, Mrs. Nellie Nugent Somerville of Greenville, and Mrs. Pauline Orr of Jacksonville. The editor noted that the rapid growth of the Southern organization, both in members and enthusiasm, is alone sufficient to contradict the prediction, which used to be frequently made, that the South would never endorse votes for women. In fact, it was generally said at Washington last year that the presence of so many charming, alert Southern women was the most inspiring thing about the convention. A review of just a few of the numerous articles appearing in the Mississippi press gives us an idea of how contested the suffrage movement was in the state, and the various arguments employed by those for and against the enfranchisement of women. On July 14, 1886, the Jackson Clarion Ledger published an essay read before the Mississippi Industrial Institute and College by Mrs. Annie C. Peyton of Hazelhurst. Now, she was an anti-suffragist. Mrs. Peyton vehemently opposed women's suffrage and stated she was proud that no Mississippi woman had gone before Congress with a list of grievances. She went on to say that women could safely trust that their best interests would be served in the ballot box by their sons and husbands, proclaiming, "Every man is a mother's son, and what Southern son would betray his mother?" On the other side of the debate, on March 24th, 1906, the Seacoast Echo dedicated the front page to a story celebrating the 86th birthday of Susan B. Anthony and detailing a ceremony which took place in Washington, where many dignitaries, including President Roosevelt, extended to her their congratulations. However, at the ceremony, Anthony remarked, "I wish the men would do something besides extend congratulations. I have asked President Roosevelt to push the matter of a constitutional amendment allowing suffrage to women by a recommendation to Congress. I would rather him say a word to Congress for the cause than to praise me endlessly." On November 9th, 1907, the Granada Sentinel ran a column titled "Progress of Women's Suffrage," where their editors provide a history of the advancement of women's suffrage in the U.S., Norway, Sweden, and Great Britain. On May 4th, 1911, the Jones County News published the resolution adopted at the annual meeting of the Mississippi Women's Suffrage Association that had recently been held in Cleveland. The resolution lauded the state of Washington for recently enfranchising women and contained additional further resolutions. Quote, that the women of Mississippi Women's Suffrage Association will redouble their efforts to secure better legislation for women and children in the industrial world, and to petition the legislature to raise the age for consent, a state disgrace, from 12 to 18 years. Nellie Nugent Somerville wrote an extensive article for the New Orleans Daily Item titled, "How Mississippi Women Work for the Ballot," in which she stated, quote, "The woman who takes absolutely no interest in any public questions is no longer the typical or ideal Southern woman." Often, newspapers carried alternatively positive and negative opinions regarding a woman's suffrage. In October 1915, the Starkville News published a column by the Honorable Elihu Root titled "On Woman's Sphere." The editor stated that the purpose of publishing the opinion was because of the importance of the decision before the states, and that it was the privilege and duty of every male voter to consider the subject carefully. This article opposed women's suffrage because Root stated it would be lost to women everywhere if they were to engage in the political process, claiming that women ruled by the sweet and noble influences of their character, which would be ruined if they were put in the franchise. However, on January 16, 1920, the Starkville News printed a letter from Professor Frederick D. Mellon, president of the Mississippi Teachers Association, where he implored, "Immediate action is imperative that we Mississippi men, proud of our reverence for women, may hold our heads up. Before another session of the legislature, either we must ratify the federal suffrage amendment, or the men of other states will, in lieu of our negligence, give civic freedom to our wives, sisters, and mothers." He further stated, "With the mere right to petition, our women can do little. With the privilege of the ballot, however, they could secure substantial appropriations for the public health, ample provisions for delinquent youth, and adequate provisions for universal education." In 1919, the State Teachers Association unanimously passed a resolution endorsing women's suffrage. Now, many newspapers like the Hattiesburg News ran regular women's suffrage notes in their editions, informing readers of local and national news related to the suffrage campaign. Others, like the Greenwood Times, which called the regular column Suffrage Notes and News, were contained in the classified sections of the paper and had regular editors. For Greenwood, that was Mrs. Monroe McClurg. One such news item announced that Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, president of the National Suffrage League, would be speaking at the convention of the Mississippi Equal Suffrage Association, and stated the convention would be held in Starkville at the Mississippi A&M College on April 12th through 14th, 1917. These news columns frequently gave updates on the advancement of the movement around the state. In 1917, the Columbus Commercial, which also ran suffrage notes, edited by the Columbus Equal Suffrage League, stated, "An unmistakable sign of the growth of suffrage sentiment in Mississippi is the endorsement the cause is receiving from the various district meetings of the State Federation of Women's Clubs, now being held in rapid succession. Resolutions for equal suffrage are being introduced in nearly every conference, and in no instance has one failed to pass by large majority, usually without a dissenting vote." The column also advised that a new suffrage league was formed in Clarksdale and announced the state convention in Starkville, where the leaders would frame an equal suffrage bill to be presented to the next session of the legislature. On January 24th, 1920, the Brookhaven Semi-Weekly Leader announced the dramatic events taking place in the Mississippi legislature related to passage of a federal women's suffrage amendment, stating, "The Mississippi House of Representatives, by a vote of 106 to 25 today, rejected the Anthony Amendment to the federal Constitution, proposing female suffrage under congressional regulation. The vote came on a resolution to reject introduced by Mr. Winter of Grenada. The resolution was popular and went through with a whoop, though not before a good bit of oratory had been filled on the subject. However, as states around the country voted to ratify the amendment, some Democratic senators felt threatened that without a vote for ratification, their party would be hurt in the upcoming presidential election, and another Republican state might get the credit for a suffrage victory. As a last-ditch effort to reverse what they saw as a potential political disaster, the Senate called for a reconsideration of the amendment. The vote was a tie, broken by the lieutenant governor in favor of ratification on March 30th, 1920. At this point, Mississippi suffragists believed that their state might be heralded as the all-important 36th and final state to ratify. However, y'all know what's coming next. However, on March 31st, the House again voted against ratification with a vote of 94 to 23. After several months enduring a political roller coaster, the Mississippi suffragists were devastated. Despite this setback, on August 27, 1920, the Liberty Southern Herald proclaimed on the front page, "Nation gets equal suffrage," and went on to describe the passage of the 19th Amendment when Tennessee satisfied the requirements that 3/4 of the states vote for ratification. The article proclaimed, quote, 70 years of struggle at last crowned with victory. Over a 10-year period, the press superintendents of the Mississippi Suffrage Association had distributed 1,700 articles, ranging in length from a paragraph to a half page, and many were given prominence in special editions. Although they were not successful in persuading the Mississippi legislature to vote for ratification, they were successful in garnering the support of the press, as evidenced by the numerous articles, columns, and editorials published over a decade in the news. And in August of 1920, the press joined in celebration with Mississippi suffragists as the Southern Herald and numerous other editions proclaimed the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment, drafted by Susan B. Anthony, contained the exact same language as that originally introduced to Congress in 1878. The rights of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Nellie Nugent Somerville summed up the relationship between the Mississippi Suffrage Association and the press, stating, quote, "The importance of press work cannot be overestimated. We owe much, every progressive movement owes much, to the generosity of the press." For nearly 100 years, in the newspapers, in the pulpit, and in public meetings and conventions, men and women spent a considerable amount of energy debating whether participation in their nation's political process was their God-given right. As a result, many suffragists were compelled to spend decades of their adult lives renegotiating their long-standing gender roles in society in order to secure a place for future generations of women to have a voice over matters that directed their everyday lives and those of their families. It is my sincere hope that in this election year, women will remember the voices of suffrage leaders. After the last celebratory suffrage parade in New York in 1920, Carrie Chapman Catt, leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and founder of the League of Women Voters, made the following remarks at the Astor Hotel. The vote is an emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours has cost millions of dollars and the lives of thousands of women. Money to carry on this work has been given, usually as a sacrifice, and thousands of women have gone without things they wanted and could have had in order that they might help get the vote for you. Women have suffered agony of soul which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. Now, I think if anybody has any questions, I think Chris is going to.
Yes, we do actually have a few here. One was they had asked the Women's Suffrage Association in Mississippi, in addition to the columns, letters, the press work, what were some of the other actions that they sponsored or took?
Well, they participated in any kind of, if there was a state fair, if there was a local fair, any kind of gathering, honestly, that they could participate in, they would show up and they had lots of flyers, gave speeches, and so they were very good at organizing on the local level, and they had frequent conventions, and even they had state conventions, but then they would have little local meetings frequently. Some of the cartoons, like we saw, people joked that, that husbands were suffering because their wives were out at meetings and things like that, and who's at home taking care of the children and things like that. And the Mississippi suffragists did that as well. They got out and went to meetings, and they were quite involved with one another and with the cause, and on the national level as well.
We have a question. Were African American women like Ida B. Wells rebuffed by official membership rules?
Not by the rules. It was more of a, there were situations at the Washington parade where Alice Paul it was suggested to her that they needed to march in the back of the parade as opposed to with the suffragists. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, she capitulated about that, even though she didn't agree with it. But they were so tunnel visioned at that time that anything that they thought that might harm their cause, then they would just go along with it, unfortunately.
Right. We have a question. Why were Mississippi women not able to vote in the 1920 presidential election?
Were they, or why were they not?
Were not.
They were not. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. It was not actually passed in our legislature until 1984 here, but of course on the national, which on the national level though, of course they were given that right, but I'm not sure about that first election.
We had a question. Was there wide agreement in Mississippi as to the voting age for women during the early years of the discussion, or was that something that was under discussion?
I didn't read anything about that, about them being particularly concerned about the voting age. I know they were trying to get the age of consent raised, right, which they did. But I haven't read anything that they were terribly concerned. I mean, it was generally 18 around the country.
Actually, I have one question. Martha Swain was a longtime friend of the Department of Archives and History and the Mississippi Historical Society, and she did a lot of work on women's suffrage in Mississippi. Were you able to draw on any of her work?
Yes, I'm sure that I did. I don't have my list of sources up here, but I do recognize the name, and she did do a lot of work on Mississippi suffrage movement.
And I know that Dr. Swain sort of came down on the side of referring to it as woman suffrage, which I saw was the name of a lot of the official.
Yeah.
But we've sort of switched over to women's suffrage, and we've all just decided that's what we're going to call it.
Yeah, at the time they called it woman suffrage because they saw themselves, they wanted to do it very much along gender roles as woman versus male. And they also felt like it was a more cohesive title, woman suffrage opposed to women's suffrage.
Right.
So we've kind of changed that terminology some, but in the beginning that's, it was woman suffrage is how they referred to it.
Sarah Campbell asks, were women of the working class active in the suffrage movement, or was it a movement of upper class women?
The working class was very involved, and there was a push with the national leaders to involve them. It's a lot of people think that it was mainly the upper class women that had the time and things like that, and a lot of the leadership was that. But because there were so many at that time during the Industrial Revolution working, they had a real stake in this. So there was a real push to involve them and their voices and their membership in these meetings.
Had this question come in. Let me find it again. Was fear of the black vote ever explicit in letters or columns opposing woman suffrage?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that was really prevalent in the opposition. It was shocking as you're researching this to go back and read what people just would say in the press and just print out there, and it was just hard to read, and about the black vote and about the slavery, and also just about their attitudes towards women. They were very blatant about it.
Yeah.
They didn't try to couch it or hide, or try to be politically correct. There was none of that going on. So it was out there, and it was very obvious.
We had one question about asking to hear more about the suffrage exhibit that you developed.
Well, yes, as you said, we were supposed to have it here on display. It's 11 posters that I created, and it was actually on display at MSU last year, and we're planning on having it on display in August in the library, which is the actual anniversary. So if people want to come see it, the library will be open then. So we're going to hang it up in the atrium, and it has a lot of this information, but it's a lot more photographs and things, and those are fun to look at.
We have a comment from Deirdre Payne, who is associated with the League of Women Voters here in Jackson. She says, Mississippi women weren't allowed to vote when the 19th Amendment was passed by Congress because Mississippi men were outraged that local women had campaigned for its passage.
That's not surprising.
Question here from Sarah Campbell. Were there local chapters of the National Association of Colored Women? Were they active beyond the suffrage movement, and in which causes?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Were there local chapters of the National Association of Colored Women? Were they active beyond the suffrage movement, and if so, in which causes?
Oh yes, they were highly active, and after suffrage was passed, they continued to be active, especially in against lynchings and Jim Crow laws and things like that. They remained very active.
One thing that you said early on, if I heard it right, was that the movement is sometimes regarded as the United States, the country's first radical feminist movement. How did the members of the suffrage movement who were still around in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, feel like it connected with what we think of as that wave of
the later feminist movement? Yeah. Well, obviously it was just, the 19th Amendment was just the beginning. And so, there were several, even after the 1920s, of course, there were several decades where, women had pretty much no other rights beyond that. They still didn't, there was still such thing as marital rape. There was still a lot of rights that women did not have.
Yeah.
And so it took a lot of years through the Supreme Court decisions and laws getting overturned that women started to fully gain more and more rights. But really the basic right to vote was just kind of the first step.
One more question here. Were women's suffrage press superintendents trained by the state or national suffrage organizations?
Trained?
Yeah, were
The press editors?
women's suffrage press superintendents.
Oh,
yeah.
I see. That was on a local level. The local suffrage organizations really were very well organized. And so they did, their own publishing, their own press releases, and so, of course, they probably modeled things after each other. When they saw something that was working, they would adopt it. And they would, our suffrage fight adopted things from England and, and things like that. And Alice Paul was actually very involved in the suffrage fight in England and then came over here and got involved in this one. So they borrowed back and forth. But on a local level, it was pretty much contained, and they weren't like trained on a national level or anything like that.
Have there been other commemorations in our neighboring states or across the Southeast planned for the centennial?
Oh, there are tons. Well, there were tons. There were, they've been planning this for years, and, you can search, you can Google them, and, there's national ones, local ones. They were going to be all over the place. Now that's up, it's very, you would have to just check with one that you wanted to participate in. Some of them have gone online, some of them have turned into digital exhibits and things. So of course COVID has kind of changed all that. So
Yeah.
I'm sure they're still trying though. They're still trying to commemorate it in some way. We don't want it just to go by without some kind of major commemoration.
Was the suffrage movement in neighboring states very different from in Mississippi? Did they ratify? Obviously, Tennessee did before Mississippi.
They did. Georgia did almost right away. All the other southern states did right away. I hate to say. And some people say, well, they didn't think what was the point because they had done it on a national level. That was really, there was no point to do it on local level, but it was kind of the, some of them ratified afterwards, obviously. But they were good. They were good about working with the other southern states, like they were involved with the Tennessee State Fair and things like that. So, they knew that they had limited funds and limited resources because they didn't have any like big corporate people backing them or things like you think about these organizations today that have that. It was as grassroots as it can come. So they were really thrilled to work with other suffragists from other states, and I think they did a good job of that.
Jen Waller asks, did you ever run across information about Minnie Brewer from Clarksdale in your research? She had a newspaper for women.
Oh, I might have. That name doesn't ring a bell. There is she's might be listed. There's a good source that people should look at. It's a bibliography of women's suffrage that's been created. I did a history for Alma Dorsey Birdsall in that, and so you can search by state, and different people have sent in biographies of these women, and it's on the web. And it's very interesting to read. People have done a lot of research about the different suffragists in every state that you would never have heard of otherwise. So you can go in and search by state, and you can search by name, and it helps to give you a little more information.
Right.
Probably she's listed there.
Right. I think we have one last question. What other influences on women's lives are there that are legacies of the Spanish and French colonial history?
What other influences? Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on that field, but I know from studying this that that women that were living in states that were under Spanish and French law had more rights, and even Indian law had more rights than typical Americans did. They had the right to own their own property, they had the right to make a will and things like that. So they were used to those rights, and they enjoyed those rights, and whereas women that lived in states that had not been under that, they didn't enjoy those kind of rights.
This was great. Thank you,
you.
Jenifer. If
Thank
you
you.
are a member of the Mississippi Historical Society, you will have received the latest issue of the Journal of Mississippi History, which has as its lead article, Lily Thompson and the Woman Suffrage Movement in Mississippi. If you are not a member of the Mississippi Historical Society, you can remedy that in just a few moments with a few keystrokes online, mississippihistory.org, and you should check that out. I hope that you'll join us again next week when Pip Gordon will be our speaker. But for now, thank you so much for coming
Thank
over
you.
from Mississippi State University for doing this, and we'll make the exhibit happen at some point. Thank you very
Okay,
much, Jenifer
sure.
Ishee.
Thank you.